The sharp, condescending laugh echoed through the cramped economy cabin, cutting through the dull hum of the jet engines. Caroline, a senior flight attendant with a perfectly pinned French twist and a heart full of prejudice, looked down her nose at the young black woman in the worn-out college hoodie. "Sweetheart, this isn't a city bus," Caroline sneered, her voice carrying loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "If you can't follow standard procedures, I'll have airport security waiting for you at the gate." The young woman didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just calmly pulled out her phone and sent a single text. 10 minutes later, the reinforced cockpit door swung open. The veteran captain marched down the aisle, his face pale as a ghost, staring directly at Caroline. What happened next ended a 15-year career and shook a billion-dollar aviation empire. Stick around, because the karma in this story is absolute. Flight 88 from New York's JFK to London Heathrow was supposed to be a standard red-eye for Hope Worldwide Airlines. For 22-year-old Evelyn Hope, it was just a desperately needed ride home. Evelyn had just survived a brutal, sleep-deprived finals week at Columbia University. She was exhausted, her eyes heavy, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, wearing baggy gray sweatpants and a faded vintage oversized hoodie. To anyone looking, Evelyn was just another exhausted college student trying to survive a 7-hour flight in the cheap seats. No one would have guessed that her father, Arthur Hope, was the founder and CEO of the very airline they were sitting on. Evelyn's mother, a brilliant black aerospace engineer named Josephine who had passed away when Evelyn was a teenager, had always taught her to stay humble. Evelyn hated the fawning and suffocating attention of first class. When she flew alone, she deliberately booked economy, using a secondary profile under her middle name, choosing to blend in rather than flaunt her billionaire status. Unfortunately, blending in made her the perfect target for Caroline Wentworth. Caroline was a 42-year-old senior flight attendant who believed she was practically airline royalty. For the last 10 years, she had exclusively worked the first-class cabins, rubbing elbows with minor celebrities and corporate executives, happily absorbing their reflected status. But today, due to a severe scheduling error and a sudden staff shortage, Caroline had been bumped back to the main economy cabin. She was furious. To Caroline, the economy class was a holding pen, and she made no effort to hide her disgust as she watched the passengers shuffle down the narrow aisle. As Evelyn reached row 34, dragging a slightly scuffed leather duffel bag, she realized the overhead bins were already packed tight. She stood on her tiptoes, trying to gently shift a carelessly placed suitcase to make room for her bag. "Excuse me," a sharp, nasal voice snapped from behind her. Evelyn turned to see Caroline standing there, hands on her hips, her lips pressed into a thin, judgmental line. Her eyes raked over Evelyn's baggy sweatpants, her bare face, and her melanin, and a visible look of disdain washed over the flight attendant's features. "You are blocking the aisle," Caroline said, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. "If your oversized luggage doesn't fit, it needs to be checked. We don't have time to wait for you to play Tetris." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the immediate hostility. "It's not oversized," Evelyn replied politely, keeping her voice low. "It meets the carry-on dimensions. There's just a coat in here taking up unnecessary space. If I could just move it," I said. Caroline interrupted, raising her voice so the passengers in rows 33 and 35 turned to watch. "You need to check the bag. People like you always try to sneak on extra baggage to avoid the fees, and it delays the flight for our paying customers. People like you." The microaggression hung heavily in the recycled cabin air. Evelyn felt a flash of heat in her chest but forced a deep breath. She knew the protocol of her father's airline better than this attendant did. "Ma'am, I paid for my ticket just like everyone else." "The bag fits," Evelyn said calmly. With a quick, decisive shove, she slid her duffel securely into the overhead bin and closed the latch with a satisfying click. She then slid into seat 34B, right in the middle, and reached for her seatbelt. Caroline stood frozen for a second, her face flushing with pure indignation. She wasn't used to being defied, certainly not by someone she deemed so entirely beneath her, and definitely not in front of an audience of economy passengers. She leaned down, bringing her face uncomfortably close to Evelyn's. "You have a terrible attitude," Caroline hissed under her breath. A venomous smile plastered on her face for the sake of the other passengers. "I'm going to be watching you on this flight. One wrong move, and I will have you restrained. Do you understand me?" Evelyn looked up, her dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. She stared right through the flight attendant. "I'd love to see you try," Evelyn whispered back. Caroline scoffed, a short, bitter sound, and spun on her heel, marching back toward the galley. The older man sitting in the window seat next to Evelyn gave her a sympathetic look. "Don't let her get to you, kid," he mumbled. "Some people just wear their miserable lives like a uniform." Evelyn offered a tight, appreciative smile, pulled her headphones over her ears, and closed her eyes. She just wanted to sleep, but Caroline Wentworth was a woman who held onto a grudge like a lifeline, and the flight had only just begun. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lights were dimmed to a soft, ambient blue. Most of the passengers were dozing, reading, or watching movies on the tiny seatback screens. Evelyn awoke with a pounding headache, a parting gift from her grueling university exams. Her throat was incredibly dry, and she desperately needed to take the ibuprofen tucked in her pocket. The seatbelt sign was off, and the flight attendants had just completed their first beverage service. Curiously, when the cart had passed row 34, Caroline had been the one pushing it. She had handed drinks to the man in the window seat and the woman in the aisle seat, completely bypassing Evelyn. When Evelyn had reached out to ask for a water, Caroline had deliberately pushed the cart forward, pretending she hadn't heard. Deciding not to make a scene earlier, Evelyn had let it go. But now, the headache was becoming unbearable. She unbuckled her seatbelt, quietly slipped past the sleeping woman in the aisle seat, and made her way toward the rear galley. Inside the galley, Caroline was leaning against the counter, filing her nails and gossiping with a younger, timid-looking flight attendant named Sarah. "Excuse me," Evelyn said politely, standing at the curtain. "Could I please get a cup of water? I have a really bad headache and need to take some medication." Caroline didn't even look up from her fingernails. She blew on them gently, before turning her head with agonizing slowness. "The beverage service is over," Caroline stated flatly. "You should have asked when the cart was in the aisle." "I did ask," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice incredibly steady. "You ignored me and walked past." "Are you calling me a liar?" Caroline snapped, finally dropping the nail file. She stepped forward, invading Evelyn's personal space once again. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl. I am not your personal servant. If you are thirsty, you can wait until the morning service before we land. Until then, return to your seat before I write you up for a federal aviation violation." Sarah, the younger attendant, looked horrified. "Caroline, it's just a cup of water," she whispered nervously. "Shut up, Sarah. I handle the troublemakers," Caroline barked. She turned her venom back to Evelyn. "Go back to your seat, now." Evelyn didn't move. The sheer audacity of the woman was baffling. As the daughter of the CEO, Evelyn had attended countless board meetings discussing passenger safety, comfort, and the core values of Hope Worldwide. This behavior wasn't just rude. It was a gross violation of company policy. "I'm not asking for a 5-course meal," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying an unexpected weight of authority. "I am asking for standard hydration, which you are legally required to provide upon request. I'd like your name and your employee ID number, please." Caroline let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the quiet hum of the back cabin. "My name? You want my name? Who exactly do you think you are going to complain to? Customer service? Do you really think they care about a discount ticket nobody in a dirty sweatshirt? They're going to take one look at you, look at my 15-year flawless record, and throw your little complaint right in the trash." "I asked for your name," Evelyn repeated, her expression turning ice cold. "No," Caroline sneered. "What you're going to get is a pair of flex cuffs. I warned you about your attitude during boarding. Now you're coming into my galley, harassing my staff, and becoming aggressive. You are an unruly passenger." Caroline reached for the internal phone that connected directly to the cockpit. "I am calling Captain Mitchell right now. I'm telling him, we have a hostile passenger threatening the crew. When we touch down at Heathrow, Metropolitan Police will be waiting to drag you off this plane in handcuffs. Let's see how much attitude you have in a holding cell." Evelyn watched as Caroline picked up the receiver, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across the flight attendant's face. Caroline genuinely believed she held all the power. She believed she could weaponize the system against a young black woman and face absolutely zero consequences. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply stepped back out of the galley, pulled her smartphone from her sweatpants pocket, and connected to the plane's complimentary Wi-Fi. She opened her messages and typed a quick text. "Hey, Uncle Tom. Sorry to bother you mid-flight. I'm in seat 34B. Your senior attendant in the back galley is threatening to have me arrested for asking for a glass of water. Could you come back here for a minute? Evelyn." She hit send to Captain Thomas Mitchell, a man who had been her father's best friend for 30 years, the man who had taught Evelyn how to ride a bicycle, and the chief pilot of this very aircraft. Back in the galley, Caroline slammed the phone down, having just left a voicemail with the co-pilot about an aggressive female in economy. She peeked through the curtain, seeing Evelyn just standing in the aisle, looking at her phone. "Enjoy your flight, sweetheart," Caroline called out, laughing that same sharp, condescending laugh. "It's going to be your last one for a very long time." Evelyn locked her phone, looked right back at Caroline, and gave a small, chilling smile. "You're absolutely right about that." Up in the reinforced, dimly lit sanctuary of the cockpit, the only sounds were the steady hum of the avionics and the quiet, static-laced chatter of air traffic control over the Atlantic. Captain Thomas Mitchell, a silver-haired aviation veteran with 25 years of flawless service under his belt, was reviewing the flight path when First Officer David Reynolds turned to him, an annoyed expression on his face. "Captain, I just got off the internal comms with the back galley," David said, shaking his head. "Caroline Wentworth is on a tear again. She's claiming there's an aggressive, unruly female passenger in the economy cabin, threatening the crew. Says we need to radio Heathrow authorities to have a holding cell ready upon arrival." Thomas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He knew Caroline's reputation well. She was a notorious complainer, a woman who treated her seniority like a loaded weapon. Usually, her complaints were wildly exaggerated, a passenger asking for a second blanket, or someone not returning their seat to an upright position fast enough. "Did she give a seat number?" Thomas asked, reaching for his logbook. "Row 34, middle seat." "34B," David replied. Right at that exact second, Thomas's personal company-issued smartphone, secured in its mount and connected to the aircraft's encrypted Wi-Fi, lit up with a silent notification. He glanced at the screen. The preview read, "Hey, Uncle Tom. Sorry to bother you mid-flight. I'm in seat 34B. Thomas froze. His blood ran cold. He unclipped the phone and opened the full message from Evelyn. He read the words twice, his jaw tightening so hard his teeth ground together. "Threatening to have me arrested for asking for a glass of water." David watched his captain's face transform from mild annoyance to absolute, terrifying fury. The color drained from Thomas's face, only to be replaced by a dark, stormy red. This wasn't just any passenger. This was Evelyn Hope. Thomas had been the best man at Arthur Hope's wedding. He had held Evelyn in the hospital the day she was born. He had watched her grow up into a brilliant, kind-hearted young woman who purposely hid her immense wealth because she loathed entitlement. And now, one of his own crew members was terrorizing her and threatening her with false arrest. "David," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low, completely devoid of its usual warmth. "You have the aircraft." "I have the aircraft," David confirmed automatically, startled by the sheer intensity radiating from the captain. "Sir, is everything all right?" "No. It's absolutely not," Thomas growled, unbuckling his 5-point harness and tossing his headset onto the console. "Call Heathrow. Cancel that security request. In fact, tell them, if Caroline Wentworth calls it in again, they are to ignore it completely. I am going back there." "You're going to economy, Captain?" "Should I prep the restraint kit?" David asked, assuming the passenger really was out of control. "The only person who might need restraining on this aircraft is my senior flight attendant," Thomas snapped. He unlocked the reinforced cockpit door and stepped out into the forward galley. The walk from the cockpit to the rear galley of a Boeing 777 is a long one. As Captain Mitchell strode through the luxurious first-class cabin, the flight attendant stationed there immediately stood up straighter, intimidated by the thunderous look in his eyes. He didn't offer his usual warm nods or smiles. He moved with a heavy, deliberate, military-like precision. He passed through the business class section, parting the heavy curtains with enough force to make the fabric snap. As he finally entered the dimly lit economy cabin, passengers who were awake turned their heads. It is incredibly rare to see the captain of a transatlantic flight marching down the aisle in full uniform, his 4 gold stripes gleaming under the ambient blue lighting, looking like a man marching toward an execution. Back in the rear galley, Caroline had just finished fixing her lipstick in a small mirror. She smoothed down her tailored skirt, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had heard the heavy footsteps approaching. She assumed it was David coming to take her statement for the police report. She pulled the curtain aside, fully prepared to play the traumatized victim, and gasped when she saw Captain Mitchell himself standing there. "Oh, Captain Mitchell," Caroline exclaimed, placing a hand over her chest in a dramatic display of relief. "Thank goodness you came yourself. It's been a nightmare. That girl right there," she pointed a perfectly manicured, accusing finger directly at Evelyn, who was standing quietly by the lavatory door. "She has been aggressive, non-compliant, and she actually threatened me physically. I feared for my safety and for the safety of Sarah here." Sarah, the younger attendant, stood in the corner, her face pale, looking down at her shoes. She was trembling, terrified of contradicting her senior, but the guilt was eating her alive. Thomas didn't even look at Caroline. He completely ignored her, pointing finger and her fabricated story. He walked straight past her, closing the distance between himself and the young black woman in the oversized college hoodie. The tension in the galley was so thick it was suffocating. "Evelyn," Thomas said softly, the anger in his voice vanishing, replaced by deep, paternal concern. "Are you all right? Your text said you had a migraine." Caroline's dramatic victim act shattered instantly. Her outstretched arm slowly lowered. Her brain struggled to process the interaction. "Evelyn, why did the captain know the discount ticket nobody's first name?" "I'm okay, Uncle Tom," Evelyn replied, her voice calm but tight with pain. "Just a really bad tension headache from exams. I just needed some water to take my pills, but your senior attendant informed me that I was an unruly passenger and that I'd be leaving Heathrow in flex cuffs." "Uncle Tom?" The words hit Caroline like a physical blow to the stomach. A cold, nauseating sweat broke out across the back of her neck. Thomas finally turned around to face Caroline. The look of paternal warmth he had given Evelyn was gone. What replaced it was a glare so venomous, so utterly disgusted, that Caroline instinctively took a step backward, her shoulder hitting the metal galley storage bins. "Captain," Caroline stammered, her voice shaking, all her previous bravado evaporating into thin air. I didn't realize. I mean, she was violating protocol. She came into the galley uninvited." "Shut your mouth," Thomas commanded. The authority in his voice was absolute. It wasn't a request. It was an order that echoed slightly into the back rows of the cabin, causing several passengers to lean out into the aisle to watch. "Do you have any idea who this young woman is, Wentworth?" Thomas asked, stepping closer to Caroline, towering over her. She's your niece?" Caroline guessed, her mind racing, panic setting in. If this was the captain's niece, she was in serious trouble. A suspension, maybe a permanent reassignment to domestic short hauls. "No," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "Her name is Evelyn Hope." Caroline stared at him, her eyes wide, uncomprehending. Hope. The name bounced around her skull. Hope Worldwide Airlines, Arthur Hope. The billionaire founder who was famous for aggressively protecting his family's privacy. "She is the daughter of Arthur Hope," Thomas continued, delivering the words like nails into a coffin. "The CEO of this airline. The man whose signature is on the very bottom of your paychecks. The owner of the aircraft you are currently standing in." For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the galley was the low, rushing roar of the jet engines outside. Caroline Wentworth stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so rapidly that Sarah stepped forward, genuinely thinking the older woman was about to pass out. The owner's daughter?" Caroline whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. Her eyes darted from Captain Mitchell to Evelyn, taking in the cheap sweatpants, the messy hair, the lack of makeup. It made absolutely no sense to her class-obsessed mind. Billionaire Harrises flew in private Gulfstreams or, at the very least, in the plush, lie-flat suites of first class, sipping champagne. They didn't fly in seat 34B. They didn't wear worn-out Columbia University hoodies. "That's right," Evelyn spoke up, her voice entirely devoid of sympathy. She looked Caroline dead in the eye. "My father prefers we understand every aspect of his company, from the boardroom to the back row of economy. He always says the true character of an employee is revealed by how they treat the people they believe are beneath them." Caroline's knees actually buckled slightly. She grabbed the edge of the galley counter to steady herself. Her 15-year flawless record, her first-class privileges, her senior pension, she could see it all evaporating in real time. "Miss Hope," Caroline choked out, her voice cracking in a pathetic display of sudden subservience. I am so incredibly sorry. This is a massive misunderstanding. The cabin was dark, we were understaffed, I was stressed. I would never, ever have spoken to you that way if I had known who you were." It was the worst possible thing she could have said. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, a flash of pure hope steel shining through. "That is exactly the problem, Caroline. You shouldn't have to know my last name to treat me like a human being. If I were just a regular college student flying home, you were fully prepared to have me falsely arrested and ruin my life just to satisfy your own ego. You weaponized your authority against me because of how I look and where I was sitting. No, that's not true," Caroline pleaded, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her heavy mascara. She looked at the captain. "Thomas, Captain Mitchell, please. I've been with this company for 15 years. I have a mortgage. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Let me make it right. Miss Hope, please, let me move you to first class. We have an open suite. I'll get you anything you want, caviar, champagne." "I don't want your champagne," Evelyn said flatly. "I wanted a cup of water and a basic level of human decency. You denied me both." Thomas Mitchell had heard enough. He turned to Sarah, the younger flight attendant, who was still watching the scene with wide, shocked eyes. "Sarah," Thomas said, "did this passenger act aggressively toward Caroline?" Sarah looked at Caroline, who was glaring at her with a desperate, silent threat in her eyes. But Sarah looked at the captain, then at Evelyn, and finally found her courage. She shook her head firmly. "No, Captain. The passenger was perfectly polite. She just asked for water for a headache. Caroline ignored her during the service, and when the passenger came back here, Caroline verbally attacked her and threatened to call the police." Caroline gasped. "You lying little—" "Enough," Thomas barked, cutting Caroline off so sharply she flinched. "Caroline Wentworth, as the captain of this vessel, I am officially relieving you of your duties for the remainder of this flight." Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Captain? You can't." "I just did," Thomas stated coldly. "Hand over your company ID lanyard, now." With trembling, manicured fingers, Caroline reached behind her neck, unclipped her navy blue lanyard with her senior gold wings attached, and handed it to the captain. She looked entirely broken, stripped of her armor. "You are confined to the crew rest compartment for the next 5 hours, Thomas ordered. "You are not to interact with any passengers. You are not to touch the service carts. If I see you in the aisles, I will have you restrained by the air marshals. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" "Yes, Captain," Caroline sobbed quietly, the humiliation complete. She grabbed her personal tote bag, keeping her head down, and practically fled the galley toward the hidden crew rest stairs, refusing to look at the economy passengers who were now openly staring and whispering. Thomas turned his attention back to Sarah. "Sarah, you are now the acting senior attendant for the main cabin. Take charge." "Yes, Captain," Sarah said, standing taller, a newfound confidence blooming in her chest. She immediately turned to the beverage cart, grabbed a large bottle of Evian water, poured a full cup, and handed it to Evelyn. "Here is your water, Miss Hope. I am so sorry about all of this." "Thank you, Sarah." Evelyn smiled warmly, taking the cup and finally swallowing her ibuprofen. "And please, call me Evelyn." Thomas gently placed a hand on his goddaughter's shoulder. "Evelyn, let me take you up to first class. It's quieter. You can actually get some sleep in a flat bed." Evelyn shook her head, taking a sip of the water. "No, Uncle Tom. Thank you, but my bag is in 34B. I paid for an economy ticket, and I intend to finish the flight in economy. Besides," she added, her voice carrying a quiet, undeniable authority, "I think I need to see firsthand how the rest of this cabin is treated under new management." Thomas smiled, a proud, affectionate grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. She was so much like her mother. "All right, kiddo. If you need anything at all, you tell Sarah, or you text me. I'll be in the front." "Will do. Have a safe flight, Captain," Evelyn replied. As Captain Mitchell made the long walk back up the aisle to the cockpit, the atmosphere in the economy cabin had completely shifted. The oppressive, judgmental weight that Caroline had brought to the rear of the plane was gone. Evelyn walked calmly back to seat 34B. The older man in the window seat stared at her with wide eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered as she sat down and buckled her seatbelt. "You really are the owner's daughter?" Evelyn just offered him a small, polite smile, pulled her faded hoodie over her head, and put her headphones back on. "I'm just a student trying to get some sleep, sir." But the storm wasn't over. While the flight across the Atlantic would now be peaceful for Evelyn, a massive corporate hurricane was brewing on the ground in London, waiting for Caroline Wentworth the moment those plane wheels touched the tarmac. The real consequences hadn't even begun. The remaining 5 hours of Flight 88 were the most peaceful Evelyn had ever experienced on a transatlantic route. With Sarah now acting as the senior attendant for the main cabin, the atmosphere transformed entirely. The economy passengers were treated with the kind of attentive, respectful service usually reserved for business class. Sarah, eager to prove herself and right the wrongs of her former supervisor, ensured every call button was answered promptly and every passenger was comfortable. Evelyn managed to get 3 solid hours of sleep, the pounding in her head finally subsiding. Above them, hidden away in the claustrophobic, bunk bed-lined crew rest compartment above the passenger ceiling, Caroline Wentworth was not sleeping. She was spiraling. Sitting on the edge of a narrow mattress, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her company-issued tablet, Caroline's mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. Denial is a powerful drug, and Caroline was fully addicted. "There is no way," she told herself, biting her thumbnail down to the quick. "There is no way Arthur Hope lets his legitimate daughter fly in a dirty hoodie in the middle seat of economy. Mitchell is lying? Or the girl is lying?" Driven by sheer panic and a refusal to accept her downfall, Caroline connected her tablet to the crew's secure Wi-Fi channel. She opened her email and drafted a frantic, heavily embellished message to Richard Hayes, a mid-level human resources director back at the New York corporate office, with whom she frequently traded first-class upgrades for favorable scheduling. "Richard, emergency," she typed, her thumbs flying across the glass screen. "Captain Mitchell has completely lost his grip on reality mid-flight. He is aggressively protecting a highly disruptive, combative passenger in economy who is falsely claiming to be Arthur Hope's daughter. Mitchell relieved me of duty and threatened me to protect this girl. I was assaulted. I need a union representative waiting at the gate at Heathrow, and I need you to file a preemptive grievance against Mitchell immediately. This is a massive liability." She hit send, a smug, desperate sense of satisfaction washing over her. She had 15 years of seniority. She had friends in corporate. She was going to spin this. She was going to walk off this plane as the victim of a power-tripping captain and an unruly passenger. Hours later, the Boeing 777 began its final descent through the thick, gray morning clouds over London. The wheels touched down on the Heathrow tarmac with a heavy screech, the reverse thrusters roaring as the massive aircraft decelerated. As the plane taxied toward Terminal 3, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed through the cabin. Immediately, passengers began to stand, stretching their legs and reaching for the overhead bins. Evelyn stayed seated, calmly packing her headphones into her scuffed leather duffel bag. Suddenly, Captain Mitchell's voice boomed over the public address system, completely lacking the usual cheerful, "Welcome to London" script. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. Do not open the overhead bins. We are requiring all passengers to remain seated while ground personnel board the aircraft. Thank you for your cooperation." A collective murmur of confusion swept through the cabin. The old man sitting in the window seat next to Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Ground personnel? Usually that means police, right?" Evelyn didn't answer. She just looked straight ahead, her face unreadable. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge connected with a heavy mechanical thud. But it wasn't the Metropolitan Police who stepped through the forward door. It was Gregory Pierce, the formidable vice president of European operations for Hope Worldwide Airlines, accompanied by 2 stern-looking corporate security officers in dark suits. Gregory, a tall, impeccably dressed British man known for his zero-tolerance policy regarding employee misconduct, did not stop to greet the first-class passengers. He marched directly past the luxury suites, past the bewildered business-class passengers, and straight to the hidden door of the crew rest stairs. He unlocked the door with a master key and climbed the short, steep steps. Caroline Wentworth. Gregory's voice snapped like a whip in the confined space. Caroline practically jumped out of her bunk. She had managed to reapply her makeup and smooth her uniform, expecting her union rep to be waiting to comfort her. Instead, she was staring at the second most powerful man in the airline's European division. "Mr. Pierce," Caroline gasped, a nervous smile fluttering on her lips. "Thank goodness. I assume HR received my email about Captain Mitchell's behavior." "Gather your belongings," Gregory interrupted, his voice absolute ice. "You are to disembark the aircraft immediately." "Of course," Caroline said, trying to maintain her air of superiority. "I need to give my statement to the authorities about the passenger in 34B. "You aren't giving a statement to anyone but me, Miss Wentworth," Gregory said, stepping aside to let the two security officers flank her. "And as for the passenger in 34B, you will not look at her, you will not speak to her, and you will not so much as breathe in her direction as you exit this aircraft. Move." Caroline's false confidence shattered completely. Escorted by the two large security men, she was marched down the crew stairs and forced to walk the entire length of the economy cabin to reach the exit. Every single passenger was watching. As she walked down the narrow aisle, stripped of her senior wings, flanked by security, she had to pass row 34. She couldn't help herself. She turned her head. Evelyn was sitting there in her baggy sweatpants, looking up at Caroline with an expression of quiet, absolute pity. "Nice knowing you." The old man in the window seat coughed loudly, causing a ripple of stifled laughter to echo from the surrounding rows. Caroline flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. She broke eye contact with Evelyn, staring at the floor as she was marched off the plane and into the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the terminal. The walk of doom was complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. 10 minutes later, Caroline found herself seated in a high-backed leather chair inside the Hope Worldwide Airlines VIP corporate boardroom, tucked away in the restricted upper levels of Heathrow's Terminal 3. The room was intimidatingly silent, soundproofed against the roar of the jets outside. Sitting across the polished mahogany table was Gregory Pierce. To his right was a man named Simon, a senior representative from the Flight Attendants Union, whom Caroline had frantically requested. "Simon, thank God," Caroline breathed, leaning forward. "You need to file a grievance right now. I was subjected to a hostile work environment." "The captain." "Stop talking, Caroline," Simon said quietly. He didn't look at her. He was staring at a thick manila folder resting on the table in front of Gregory. "Just stop talking." Gregory opened the folder. "Miss Wentworth. At 3:14 a.m. GMT, you used the internal cockpit phone to report a hostile, aggressive passenger threatening the crew. You requested that the captain radio Heathrow authorities to have a holding cell prepared for this passenger upon landing." "Yes," Caroline insisted, her voice shrill. She refused to follow orders. She invaded the galley space. At 3:17 a.m., Gregory continued, his voice cutting through hers effortlessly, Captain Mitchell entered the rear galley. He found no evidence of an aggressive passenger. He instead found you verbally abusing a passenger who was simply asking for water for medical reasons. We have signed, sworn written statements from First Officer Reynolds, Junior Attendant Sarah Jenkins, and Captain Mitchell himself. They're lying to cover for her." Caroline shrieked, panic entirely consuming her. "Richard Hayes in HR will vouch for my record. I have a flawless 15-year history with this company." Gregory offered a cold, predatory smile. "Ah, yes, Richard Hayes. You'll be interested to know that Mr. Hayes was escorted out of our New York headquarters by corporate security approximately 20 minutes ago. His employment has been terminated." Caroline's jaw dropped. "What? Why?" "Because..." A new, incredibly deep, resonant voice echoed through the boardroom. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall flared to life. The high-definition camera feed connected to a luxurious, dimly lit office in Manhattan. Sitting behind a massive oak desk, looking furious enough to bend steel with his bare hands, was Arthur Hope. The billionaire CEO of Hope Worldwide Airlines stared through the lens directly at Caroline. "Because, Miss Wentworth," Arthur Hope said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "When my daughter texted her godfather about your behavior, we decided to do a little digging into that flawless record of yours. Caroline shrank back into her leather chair, the air completely knocked out of her lungs. Facing the CEO, the father of the girl she had tormented was a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. It turns out, Arthur continued, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his desk, your record isn't flawless at all. Over the past 4 years, there have been 11 separate complaints filed against you by economy passengers. Complaints of racial profiling, aggressive language, and denying basic services. But mysteriously, all 11 of those complaints were routed to Richard Hayes, who buried them in the system to protect his favorite first-class upgrade supplier. Caroline looked wildly at Simon, her union rep. Simon, do something. This is a witch hunt. Simon closed his briefcase and stood up. He looked down at Caroline with pure disgust. Falsifying a security threat aboard an international flight is a violation of federal aviation law, Caroline. The union protects workers from unfair practices. We do not protect criminals who weaponize security protocols against innocent passengers. You are on your own. Without another word, Simon walked out of the boardroom, the door clicking shut behind him with a terrifying finality. Mr. Hope, please, Caroline begged, tears streaming down her face, finally realizing there was no one left to manipulate, no one left to save her. I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know she was your daughter. And that, Arthur Hope said, his eyes narrowing, is the exact reason you are sitting in that chair. Evelyn doesn't fly in economy because she has to, Caroline. She flies in economy because she acts as my eyes and ears. She audits the actual culture of my airline. We spend millions on training our staff to treat every single passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their ticket class, their skin color, or the clothes they wear. Arthur sat back, his expression turning to stone. You didn't just insult an economy passenger. You attempted to ruin a young black woman's life by threatening her with police action because you felt entitled to disrespect her. If she had been anyone else, your little fabricated story might have gotten her arrested, thrown in a foreign jail, and left with a permanent record. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Caroline sobbed into her hands. Gregory, Arthur said, turning his attention to the VP. Conclude the meeting. Yes, sir, Gregory said, turning to Caroline. Caroline Wentworth. Your employment with Hope Worldwide Airlines is terminated immediately for cause. Because you are being fired for cause specifically, violating federal safety protocols by fabricating a security threat, your company pension is entirely forfeit. Caroline let out a strangled gasp, her head snapping up. My pension? You can't. That's 15 years. I can, and I just did, Gregory replied flatly. Furthermore, Hope Worldwide is legally obligated to report your false security threat to the Civil Aviation Authority here in the UK and the FAA in the United States. Your flight credentials will be permanently revoked. You will never work in commercial aviation again. The finality of the words hit Caroline like a freight train. Everything she had built, her status, her income, her first-class lifestyle, her retirement wiped out in a matter of hours, all because she couldn't resist the urge to punch down at a young woman in a faded hoodie. Leave your company ID, your tablet, and your corporate credit card on the table, Gregory ordered. Security will escort you to the public terminal. You will have to purchase your own ticket back to the United States on a different airline. You are permanently banned from flying Hope Worldwide. Arthur Hope looked at the broken, sobbing woman through the monitor one last time. Let this be a lesson, Miss Wentworth. True class isn't about where you sit on an airplane. It's about how you treat the people around you. The screen went black. The meeting was over. The karma was absolute. The glass doors of the Hope Worldwide corporate offices hissed shut behind Caroline Wentworth with a sound that felt like the closing of a tomb. She stood on the curb of the Heathrow departures level, her 2 designer suitcases, once symbols of her status, resting on the cold concrete. For 15 years, she had walked through this terminal with her chin held high, the gold wings on her chest acting as a skeleton key to a world of luxury. Now, the wings were gone, confiscated like contraband. Her company phone was a paperweight. Her credit cards were declined. The reality of for-cause termination began to set in with a cold, numbing precision. In the aviation world, a for-cause firing involving a safety violation was a digital scarlet letter. It didn't just stay in Arthur Hope's file. It was uploaded to the centralized industry database. Caroline pulled out her personal phone and tried to log into her bank account. She needed to book a flight home, not on Hope, obviously, but perhaps on British Airways or Virgin Atlantic. Her hand shook as she saw the balance. Without her quarterly bonus, and with the sudden freeze on her severance pending the FAA investigation, she was looking at a few $1,000s and a massive mortgage in Long Island that she could no longer afford. She walked toward the ticket counter of a rival airline, her head low. The line was long, filled with families and tired travelers. Next, a young man behind the counter called out. Caroline stepped forward, trying to summon a shred of her old authority. "I need a one-way ticket to JFK, the next available flight." The agent tapped at his keys. "That will be $1,400 for economy, ma'am." "We're nearly full." "Economy?" Caroline winced, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Do you have anything in business?" I'm a frequent flyer." The agent looked at her screen, then back at Caroline. He recognized the uniform she was still wearing, though the insignia had been ripped off. "News travels fast in an airport. I'm sorry, ma'am. Economy is all we have. And I'll need a valid credit card." Caroline handed over her personal visa. The agent swiped it. "Declined." "Try it again," Caroline hissed, her face burning as the people in line behind her began to mutter. "It's declined, ma'am. Do you have another form of payment?" She didn't. She stood there, the senior flight attendant who had spent a decade sneering at the people in row 34, now unable to even afford a seat amongst them. She had to step out of line, dragging her bags to a plastic chair in the corner of the terminal, where she sat for 6 hours waiting for her sister to wire her money from New York. As she sat there, she looked up at the giant monitors, displaying the arrivals and departures. A news crawl on a nearby television caught her eye. It was a business segment on Sky News, featuring a brief interview with a real-world aviation analyst, Clive Irving. They were discussing the Hope Undercover Initiative. The reporter mentioned that Hope Worldwide had just released a statement regarding a total restructuring of cabin culture following a high-profile incident. Caroline watched in horror as her own name wasn't mentioned, but her actions were described as the catalyst for a new industry-wide standard for passenger protection. She wasn't even a person anymore. She was a cautionary tale. While Caroline was facing the wreckage of her career, the atmosphere at the Hope London penthouse was vastly different. Evelyn had changed into a simple sweater and jeans, the student persona shed for the moment. She sat on a terrace overlooking the Thames, a hot cup of tea in her hands. Her father, Arthur, sat across from her, having finished a series of grueling calls with the board of directors. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice weary but proud. "I knew there were pockets of toxicity in the company, but I didn't realize it had reached that level of arrogance." "It's not just the company, Dad," Evelyn replied softly. "It's the system." Caroline felt she could get away with it because she thought no one was watching. She thought I didn't matter because I didn't look like I had money. Arthur nodded. "That changes today. Gregory is already drafting the Evelyn Hope Protocol. Every flight attendant, from the new hires to the seniors, will undergo a mandatory bias and de-escalation retraining program. And Sarah Jenkins, the girl who stood up for you, she's special," Evelyn smiled. She was terrified, but she did the right thing anyway. "She's been promoted to lead training coordinator for the European hub," Arthur said. "She'll be the one teaching the new recruits how to actually treat people. And as for you, I think it's time you stop being an undercover auditor and start being a director." Evelyn looked at him, surprised. "Director of what?" "Director of Passenger Experience," Arthur said firmly. "You have the one thing no MBA can buy, empathy. You know what it feels like to be in seat 34B. I want you to make sure no one ever feels that way again on a Hope flight." Evelyn looked out over the London skyline. She thought about the weight of the water cup Sarah had handed her. She thought about the fear in Caroline's eyes when the nobody became the somebody. "I'll take the job," Evelyn said. "But on one condition." "Anything," Arthur replied. "I still fly economy once a month. Unannounced. No security. No Uncle Tom in the cockpit." Arthur laughed, a deep, warm sound. "I wouldn't expect anything less." 1 year later, a woman named Caroline worked behind the counter of a small, dusty, dry cleaning shop in a quiet corner of New Jersey. Her French twist was gone, replaced by a frayed ponytail. Her manicured nails were short and stained with chemicals. She spent her days handling the expensive clothes of people who didn't know her name. She watched as women in tailored suits dropped off their silk blouses and men in expensive coats handed over their cashmere. Sometimes they were rude. Sometimes they didn't even look her in the eye as they tossed their laundry on the counter. One afternoon, a young woman walked in. She was wearing a professional blazer and carrying a leather briefcase. She looked familiar, but Caroline couldn't quite place her. "I have a suit to be pressed," the woman said, placing the garment on the counter. "I have a big meeting tomorrow." Caroline took the suit, her eyes catching the tag on the briefcase. M. Hope, Hope Worldwide. Caroline froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up, waiting for the mockery, waiting for the "I told you so." But Evelyn Hope didn't mock her. She didn't even acknowledge the past. She simply looked at Caroline, really looked at her, and offered a polite, professional smile. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly. "I appreciate the help." Evelyn turned and walked out of the shop, leaving Caroline standing there in the silence of the steam and the starch. The karma hadn't just been losing the job or the money. The real karma was the realization that the nobody she had tried to crush was the only person in the world who still treated her like a human being. Caroline lowered her head and went back to work. She finally understood true power wasn't the ability to look down on others. It was the choice to look them in the eye. The story of Evelyn Hope and Caroline Wentworth serves as a powerful reminder that the world is much smaller than we think, and our actions always have a way of coming back to us. Caroline lost everything, her career, her status, and her pride, all because she chose to weaponize her position against someone she thought was powerless. In the end, the very person she tried to humiliate became the one who set the standard for a better, more respectful future in the skies. It's a classic case of what happens when the owner's daughter decides to see the world for what it truly is. The hum of the jet engines should have been the soundtrack to a peaceful transatlantic journey, but at 30,000 feet, prejudice has no place to hide. When a veteran flight attendant looked at the man settling into seat 2A, a black man wearing a simple, unassuming hoodie, she immediately decided he didn't belong in first class. She demanded he move to economy. She threatened him with security and arrest. What she didn't know was that the man she was publicly humiliating held her entire career in his hands, and a massive wave of brutal karma was about to hit. Flight PA 711 from New York's JFK to London Heathrow was known among the flight crews of Pan Global Airways as the Money Run. It was the flagship route, regularly ferrying hedge fund managers, A-list celebrities, and old money aristocrats across the Atlantic, in a cabin that resembled a five-star hotel more than an aircraft. The first-class cabin featured sliding privacy doors, lay-flat beds, and a menu curated by a Michelin-starred chef. It was an environment built on exclusivity, and no one guarded that exclusivity more fiercely than Camilla Langdon. Camilla, a senior purser with 26 years at Pan Global, considered herself less of a flight attendant and more of a gatekeeper to the elite. At 54, with her uniform immaculately tailored and her blonde hair sprayed into a rigid, unmoving updo, she had survived corporate restructurings, union battles, and passenger complaints by mastering the art of fawning over the right people and dismissing the wrong ones. Over the years, Camilla had developed a highly specific, deeply flawed mental filter for who belonged in her cabin. Wealth, to Camilla, had a specific look, a specific voice, and a specific complexion. On this damp Tuesday evening, boarding was underway. Camilla stood at the front galley, greeting passengers with a practiced, radiant smile, handing out flutes of vintage champagne. She had just warmly welcomed Charles Kensington, a silver-haired investment banker she recognized from previous flights, taking his tailored suit jacket and hanging it with exaggerated care. Then, Mason Sterling walked onto the plane. Mason was 38, a brilliant software architect, and the founder of a cybersecurity firm that had just been acquired for a staggering $2 billion. More importantly, as part of a massive portfolio diversification, Mason's holding company had quietly purchased a 14% majority voting stake in Pan Global Airways just 2 weeks prior. He was, for all intents and purposes, one of the most powerful men in the airline's corporate hierarchy. He had specifically booked this flight to London to attend a quiet board meeting, and he had intentionally dressed down to see how his airline treated its everyday customers. Mason wore a high-quality but completely unbranded charcoal gray hoodie, a simple white t-shirt, well-fitted dark jeans, and a pair of clean white sneakers. His noise-canceling headphones rested around his neck, and he carried a worn leather duffel bag that had seen 100 business trips. He was exhausted from days of intense legal negotiations, looking forward to nothing more than a hot meal, a glass of water, and 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep. As Mason stepped through the aircraft door and turned left toward the first-class cabin, Camilla immediately stepped into his path, her radiant smile vanishing, replaced by a tight, incredibly patronizing smirk. "Excuse me, sir," Camilla said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that thinly veiled her contempt. "The main cabin is to your right, straight down the aisle." Mason paused, politely returning her gaze. "I'm in 2A. That's to the left, correct?" Camilla's eyes dropped down to his sneakers, then scanned up to his hoodie, her expression hardening. "Sir, the left is our diamond first-class cabin. Economy is to the right. I need you to keep moving so other passengers can board." Mason, accustomed to being underestimated but too tired to play games, simply pulled his phone from his pocket, opened his digital wallet, and held up the screen. The bright digital boarding pass clearly displayed, Sterling, Mason. Seat 2A, Diamond First. Camilla stared at the screen for a fraction of a second too long. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. She didn't apologize. She didn't offer to take his bag. She simply stepped back, making the path as narrow as possible, and gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well. Seat 2A is by the window," she muttered, her tone suggesting he had somehow forged the document. Mason moved past her, effortlessly stowing his duffel in the overhead bin before sinking into the plush leather of Seat 2A. He exhaled a long breath, pulling his headphones up over his ears. He wasn't entirely surprised by the interaction. He had lived his entire life navigating the exhausting reality of being a black man in spaces where people assumed he didn't belong. He usually let the minor slights roll off his back. But as the cabin continued to fill, the microaggressions became impossible to ignore. A junior flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, appeared with a silver tray of pre-flight champagne and warm mixed nuts. As she approached Mason's row, Camilla suddenly appeared, placing a firm hand on Sarah's arm and loudly whispering, "Skip 2A for now, Sarah. Take those to Mr. Kensington in 3F. I'll handle row 2. Sarah looked confused but obeyed her senior purser. Mason watched this exchange in the reflection of his window. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. Every other passenger in the 12-seat cabin was sipping champagne or sparkling water, reviewing the dinner menu, and settling in. Mason's side table remained completely empty. When Camilla finally walked past his seat, carrying an empty tray back to the galley, Mason politely raised a hand. "Excuse me. Could I just get a glass of water, please?" Camilla stopped, looking down her nose at him. "We are currently preparing the cabin for departure, sir. I will be with you when I have a moment." She spun on her heel and walked away, immediately stopping to ask Charles Kensington if the temperature of his champagne was to his liking. Mason pulled his phone back out and opened the Notes app. He had wanted to audit the airline's customer service, and he was certainly getting an education. He jotted down Camilla's name, which he had read off her gold name tag, and noted the time. He had no intention of causing a scene or throwing his weight around. He merely planned to hand his notes to the CEO in London the following morning. But Camilla wasn't done. The boarding doors were scheduled to close in less than 5 minutes, and the sight of Mason sitting in seat 2A looking entirely too comfortable, entirely too unbothered, was eating away at her deeply ingrained prejudices. In Camilla's mind, the system had made a mistake, a glitch, a fraudulent booking. She convinced herself that there was no legitimate way this young man in a hooded sweatshirt had paid $10,000 for a transatlantic first-class ticket. And Camilla, with 26 years of seniority protecting her, decided she was going to fix the glitch herself. The chime echoed through the aircraft, signaling that boarding was nearly complete. The chaotic shuffle of the economy cabin behind them settled into a low hum. In first class, the lighting dimmed to a soft, ambient purple. Mason had just connected his laptop to the onboard Wi-Fi, intending to send one last email to his chief operating officer before takeoff. Heavy footsteps approached his suite. Mason looked up to find Camilla standing directly over him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The patronizing smirk was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated hostility. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again," Camilla demanded. She didn't ask. She issued an order. Her voice was intentionally loud, designed to carry across the quiet cabin and draw the attention of the surrounding wealthy passengers. Mason calmly closed his laptop. "Is there a problem?" "I need to verify the manifest," Camilla said sharply. "We have a discrepancy in our seating, and I need to see your ticket." Mason unlocked his phone and brought up the Pan Global app, holding it out for her to see. "Sterling, Mason, seat 2A. Camilla didn't even look at the phone. "That's a digital copy. I need to see a printed boarding pass. Anyone can take a screenshot of someone else's ticket." Mason raised an eyebrow, his patience beginning to fray at the edges, though his voice remained exceptionally calm. "I didn't print a paper pass. The digital pass was scanned by your gate agent, which is how I was allowed onto the aircraft. Furthermore, my name is on the digital pass." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his driver's license. "Here is my ID, matching the name on the ticket." Camilla glanced at the ID, but her expression remained rigid. She had already committed to a narrative in her head, and she was not going to back down in front of her preferred passengers. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but there has been an error. This seat is reserved for a VIP executive who requires it for security reasons. You must have been upgraded by mistake due to a system glitch. I am going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and relocate to the main cabin." Mason stared at her. It was a blatant, poorly constructed lie. "A system glitch," he repeated, his tone flat. "And you're telling me that a VIP executive is somehow going to materialize in the next 2 minutes before the doors close and take this seat? That is none of your concern," Camilla snapped, her face flushing with anger at being challenged. "What is your concern is following crew member instructions. I need you to move to row 45 immediately." Across the aisle, Charles Kensington let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "For God's sake," the banker muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can we just get this sorted? Some of us have early meetings in London, and we'd like to take off on time. If you're in the wrong seat, pal, just move back where you belong." Camilla looked at Charles, giving him an apologetic, sympathetic nod before turning her glare back to Mason. "You are causing a disturbance, sir. Pan Global Airways reserves the right to refuse service to anyone who disrupts the flight. Now, grab your bag." Mason didn't move a muscle. He sat back in his seat, his posture relaxed but commanding. "Camilla," he said, using her name deliberately, "I am not causing a disturbance. I am sitting in the seat that I purchased. I am not moving to row 45. I strongly suggest you go check with the gate agent, or perhaps check your onboard iPad manifest before you escalate this any further." "Do not tell me how to do my job," Camilla hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and panic. She had never had a passenger, let alone a black man she had mentally categorized as a fraud, speak to her with such quiet, absolute authority. "I am the senior purser on this aircraft. I am giving you a direct order. If you do not vacate this seat right now, I will call ground security, and I will have you forcibly removed from this airplane. You will be arrested for interfering with a flight crew." Sarah, the junior flight attendant, had crept up behind Camilla, clutching her tablet nervously. "B," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I checked the tablet. His name is on the manifest. It's a confirmed diamond booking, no upgrade history. It's fully paid." Camilla whipped her head around, glaring at the younger woman. "The system is wrong, Sarah. Go back to the galley, now." She turned back to Mason, pointing a trembling finger at the aisle. "Last chance. Get up." Mason looked at the pointing finger, then looked up into Camilla's eyes. He felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over him. He was no longer just a passenger dealing with a racist employee. He was an owner, looking at a massive liability to his brand. "Call security," Mason said softly. "In fact, don't just call security, call the captain." Camilla let out a harsh, barking laugh. "The captain? You think the captain gives a damn about a system glitch in seat 2A? The captain is preparing to fly this jet across the ocean. I am the authority back here, and I am telling you, you are off this flight." She snatched the intercom phone from the wall of the galley, punching in the code to contact the gate agents directly. "This is Camilla in first," she barked into the receiver, her eyes locked on Mason. "I have a non-compliant passenger in 2A. He is refusing to leave the premium cabin. I need a Port Authority police unit and a gate supervisor down the jet bridge immediately to escort him off." A heavy silence descended over the first-class cabin. The other passengers watched in varying states of shock, discomfort, and in Charles Kensington's case, smug satisfaction. Mason remained perfectly still. He pulled out his phone again, not to record, but to send a single, brief text message to the global CEO of Pan Global Airways, a man he was scheduled to have dinner with in exactly 20 hours. Flight PA 711. Delay imminent. Purser Camilla Langdon, attempting to have me arrested for sitting in my purchased seat. You may want to call the cockpit. He hit send. Up at the front of the aircraft, the heavy, reinforced door to the flight deck suddenly unlatched with a loud mechanical clack. The door swung open, and Captain David Mitchell, a former Air Force pilot with 30 years of commercial flight experience, a man known for his zero-tolerance policy for nonsense on his aircraft, stepped out into the galley. Captain Mitchell took one look at Camilla holding the intercom, breathing heavily, and then looked at the young man sitting quietly in 2A. The real turbulence hadn't even started yet. Captain David Mitchell was a man who commanded a room simply by occupying it. Standing at 6'2", with a crisp, immaculately pressed uniform and the sharp, assessing eyes of a former military aviator, he did not tolerate chaos on his flight deck, nor did he tolerate it in his cabin. He had heard the shrill, elevated pitch of Camilla's voice through the reinforced cockpit door, a sound that usually indicated a severe passenger disturbance. He stepped into the narrow galley space, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw Camilla, red-faced and gripping the intercom phone like a weapon. He saw young Sarah, looking pale and terrified, clutching a manifest tablet to her chest. He saw the faces of the first-class passengers, a mix of annoyance and morbid curiosity. And finally, he saw the man in seat 2A. The man in the hoodie wasn't yelling. He wasn't gesturing wildly. He was simply sitting there, entirely composed, projecting an aura of quiet, immovable granite. What exactly is the situation here, Camilla? Captain Mitchell asked, his voice a low, resonant baritone that immediately cut through the tension in the cabin. Camilla spun around, her face instantly morphing from aggressive rage to a mask of exaggerated, victimized distress. Captain, thank goodness, we have a severe security issue. This individual, she pointed a sharp fingernail at Mason, has fraudulently boarded the aircraft and stolen a seat in Diamond First. He is refusing my direct orders to relocate to his proper seat in the main cabin, and he is becoming belligerent. I've already called ground security to have him escorted off. Mitchell frowned, his eyes flicking back to Mason. Is this true, sir? Before Mason could open his mouth to reply, heavy footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. The main cabin door was still open, and two Port Authority police officers, weighed down by heavy tactical belts and radios crackling with static, stepped onto the aircraft. They were flanked by a breathless Pan Global Airways gate supervisor named Thomas. Who needs to be removed? The lead officer, a burly man with a shaved head, asked loudly, his hand resting instinctively near his utility belt. Camilla immediately stepped forward, pointing at Mason. Him. Seat 2A. He is refusing crew instructions and trespassing in the premium cabin. I want him off my flight immediately. The two officers turned their attention to Mason. The atmosphere in the cabin grew instantly heavier, the kind of suffocating silence that precedes a violent storm. Charles Kensington, the wealthy banker in row 3, leaned forward, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips, eager to watch the disruption be forcefully handled. Sir, the lead officer said, stepping into the aisle and looming over Mason. You need to gather your personal items and come with us. Right now. Don't make this difficult. Mason looked up at the officer, then shifted his gaze to Captain Mitchell. He still hadn't moved. Captain, Mason said, his voice smooth and remarkably steady. Before this escalates into a massive legal and public relations disaster for Pan Global, I suggest you ask your junior flight attendant to show you the digital manifest she is currently holding. Do not listen to him, Camilla interjected loudly, stepping between the captain and Sarah. He's trying to manipulate the situation. The system had a glitch. Officers, get him out of here. Hold on a second, Captain Mitchell barked, raising a hand. The sheer authority in his voice made the police officers pause. Mitchell was the supreme commander of the aircraft. Until those doors closed, his word was the final law. He looked at Camilla, his eyes narrowing. A system glitch? What kind of glitch, Camilla? He doesn't belong here, David, Camilla insisted, her professional veneer cracking, revealing the ugly, raw prejudice underneath. Look at him. He's not a Diamond First passenger. The system made an error, and I am correcting it to protect the integrity of our cabin." Mitchell stared at her, a cold realization dawning on him. He had flown with Camilla for years. He knew her snobbery, but he had never seen her blatantly fabricate a scenario to enforce her own biases. He turned to the junior flight attendant. "Sarah, bring me the tablet." Sarah hesitated, terrified of Camilla's wrath. But the captain's order was absolute. She bypassed Camilla and handed the iPad to Mitchell. "Captain, his name is on the manifest. It's not an upgrade. It's a fully paid revenue ticket, cleared by TSA, cleared by the gate scanner." Mitchell looked down at the screen. Mason Sterling, seat 2A. Suddenly, the first officer, Greg, threw open the cockpit door. He looked pale, holding a red emergency line handset. "Captain," Greg said, his voice tight with urgency, loud enough for the front half of the cabin to hear. "I need you on the flight deck. Right now. I have the Global Operations Center on the emergency line, and they have the CEO's office patched through." Camilla froze. The color rapidly drained from her face. The CEO? Why would the CEO of Pan Global Airways be calling the cockpit of a commercial flight 5 minutes before departure? Captain Mitchell handed the tablet back to Sarah. He looked at Mason, noticing for the first time the supreme, unwavering confidence in the man's eyes. Mason simply gave the captain a fraction of a nod. "Officers, stand down. Nobody touches this passenger," Mitchell ordered sharply. He turned and strode quickly into the cockpit, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening. The police officers exchanged confused glances, stepping back from Mason's row. Camilla stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to maintain her haughty posture, but a cold sweat was beginning to form on her neck. She looked at Mason. He wasn't looking at her. He had reopened his laptop and was casually typing an email, completely ignoring the armed police officers standing 3 feet away. "This is ridiculous," Charles Kensington muttered from row 3, though his voice lacked its earlier bravado. "We're going to miss our departure slot." 2 minutes passed. To Camilla, it felt like 2 hours. Her mind raced, desperately trying to connect the dots. A system glitch, a stubborn passenger, a call from the CEO. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Then, the cockpit door unlatched again. Captain David Mitchell stepped back into the galley. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. The easygoing demeanor he usually reserved for his crew was completely gone. He didn't look at the police officers. He didn't look at the gate supervisor. He walked straight toward Camilla Langdon. "Captain," the lead police officer started, "do you want us to?" "I want you to wait on the jet bridge, officers," Mitchell interrupted, his voice frighteningly calm. "Thank you for your prompt response, but there is no security threat here. The only disturbance on this aircraft was manufactured by my crew." The officers, recognizing a messy internal corporate dispute when they saw one, gladly nodded and retreated toward the main cabin door. Stepping out onto the jet bridge to wait, Camilla swallowed hard, her throat suddenly bone dry. "David, Captain, I assure you, I was only following protocol." "Stop talking, Camilla," Mitchell said, his voice dropping an octave. The sheer command in his tone made Camilla snap her mouth shut. Mitchell turned his back to her and faced seat 2A. He stood at attention, a gesture of deep, formal respect. "Mr. Sterling," the captain said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the completely silent cabin. "I have just concluded a conversation with the chief executive officer of this airline. He extends his profound, personal apologies for the treatment you have endured this evening. And I, as the commander of this vessel, offer you my sincerest apologies as well." A collective gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Charles Kensington dropped his phone into his lap. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands. Mason slowly closed his laptop and looked up at the captain. "Thank you, Captain Mitchell. I appreciate you taking the time to verify the facts." Mitchell nodded tightly, then slowly turned back to Camilla. The senior purser looked as if the floor had completely dropped out from beneath her. Her carefully constructed world of elitism and gatekeeping was shattering into a million pieces. "Camilla," Mitchell said, his voice slicing through the quiet air like a scalpel. "You lied to a passenger. You lied to a gate supervisor. You lied to the Port Authority police. And worst of all, you lied to me, your captain." You attempted to forcefully and unlawfully remove a ticketed passenger simply because you decided, based on your own prejudiced assumptions, that he did not look like he belonged in your cabin. I thought it was fraud, Camilla stammered, her voice trembling, tears of panic finally pricking the corners of her eyes. I've been here 26 years, David. I know our clientele. You don't know anything, Mitchell fired back, taking a step closer to her. You have no idea who is sitting in that seat. Mr. Sterling is not a glitch. He is not a fraud. As of 2 weeks ago, Mr. Mason Sterling's holding company became the largest single majority voting shareholder of Pan Global Airways. The silence that followed was so profound, you could hear the hum of the aircraft's air conditioning vents. Charles Kensington's jaw practically unhinged. The man he had just told to move back where he belonged was effectively the owner of the very airline he was flying on. Kensington sank lower into his plush leather seat, suddenly finding the safety card in his seatback pocket incredibly fascinating. Camilla swayed on her feet. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. Shareholder, she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked at Mason, the young black man in the gray hoodie she had tried to have dragged off the plane in handcuffs. He owned the plane. He owned the company. He owned her pension. Mr. Sterling didn't want a red carpet, Mitchell continued mercilessly. He booked a standard ticket to fly quietly to a board meeting in London. He wanted to see how this airline treats its passengers when the cameras aren't rolling and the VIP tags aren't flashing. And you, Camilla, have just shown him exactly how rotten our customer service can be. I'm sorry, Camilla choked out, the tears now spilling over her heavy mascara, ruining her pristine look. She looked at Mason, her hands shaking. Mr. Sterling, I am so deeply sorry. It was a terrible misunderstanding. Please, I have 26 years with this company. I have a family. Mason looked at her, his expression devoid of gloating, but equally devoid of pity. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Camilla, Mason said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a verdict. A misunderstanding is bringing the wrong meal. What you did was an active, deliberate campaign to humiliate me because of how I look. You didn't care about my family or my dignity when you called armed police to drag me out of here. Camilla sobbed, a pathetic, gasping sound. She looked to the captain for a lifeline, for union solidarity, for anything. Thomas, Captain Mitchell called out to the gate supervisor, who was still standing nervously near the galley. Yes, Captain? Escort Miss Langdon off my aircraft, Mitchell ordered. She is relieved of duty, effective immediately. Inform crew scheduling, we are flying with minimum cabin crew, and promote Sarah to acting purser for this sector. I will file the formal termination paperwork with human resources the moment we touch down at Heathrow. David, no, you can't, Camilla wailed, reaching out to grab the captain's sleeve. Mitchell stepped back, his face turning to granite. I just did. Gather your bags, Camilla. You are no longer an employee on this flight, and I highly doubt you will be an employee of this airline by sunrise. Get off my plane. Defeated, humiliated, and entirely broken by the brutal, instantaneous weight of karma, Camilla stumbled into the forward galley closet. With trembling hands, she grabbed her designer roller bag and her impeccably tailored coat. She couldn't look anyone in the eye as she dragged her luggage down the aisle. She had to walk past the police officers she had summoned, past the gate agent, and out onto the sterile, fluorescent-lit jet bridge. The heavy aircraft doors swung shut behind her with a definitive, echoing thud. Inside the cabin, the heavy tension began to evaporate, replaced by a stunned, awe-filled relief. Captain Mitchell smoothed his tie and turned back to Mason, his professional demeanor seamlessly returning. Mr. Sterling, we have our clearance. We will be wheels up in approximately 10 minutes. Can acting purser Sarah get you anything before we push back? Mason smiled for the first time since he boarded. He looked at young Sarah, who was standing a little taller now, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and newly minted responsibility. Just that glass of water, please, Sarah, Mason said kindly. And then, let's get to London. The heavy metallic thud of the aircraft doors sealing shut felt like a physical weight lifting off the first-class cabin. As Flight PA 711 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi down the JFK runway, the atmosphere inside the premium suite transformed entirely. The tension that had practically vibrated in the air dissipated, replaced by the low, soothing hum of the jet engines, and the soft purple ambient lighting. Mason Sterling finally received his glass of water. Sarah, now unexpectedly thrust into the role of acting purser, approached seat 2A with a silver tray. Her hands were still trembling slightly, a residual effect of witnessing a 26-year veteran of the airline spectacularly implode, but her posture was straighter. "Here is your water, Mr. Sterling," Sarah said softly, placing the crystal glass on his side console along with a warm towel. "And again, on behalf of the entire crew, I am so incredibly sorry for what you just experienced." Mason offered her a warm, reassuring smile. The formidable, unyielding presence he had projected during the standoff with Camilla melted away, revealing a surprisingly gentle demeanor. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, Sarah. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You checked the manifest and tried to tell the truth. I appreciate your integrity." Sarah blushed, nodding quickly before moving gracefully down the aisle to attend to the other passengers. Across the aisle, Charles Kensington was sweating. The silver-haired investment banker, who had just minutes prior loudly suggested Mason move back where he belonged, was now frantically calculating the professional damage he might have just inflicted upon himself. Kensington's firm heavily traded in the tech sector, offending a billionaire holding company owner whose firm practically dictated market trends was a career-ending move. As the seatbelt sign chimed off, Kensington unbuckled and leaned across the aisle, forcing a hearty, sickeningly artificial chuckle. "Mason, my apologies. I didn't recognize you." Kensington beamed, extending a hand that Mason pointedly ignored. "Charles Kensington. Kensington and Weil. Good Lord, what an absolute circus that was, eh? You know how these legacy flight attendants get stuck in their old ways. Complete misunderstanding. If I had known who you were..." Mason slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the banker. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. "If you had known who I was, Charles, you would have treated me with basic human decency," Mason said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to draw blood. "But because you thought I was a nobody, you felt entirely comfortable cheering for my humiliation." Kensington's smile vanished. He retracted his hand as if the air around Mason had suddenly caught fire. "Your firm pitched my holding company for a merger acquisition role last month," Mason continued, his tone conversational but entirely lethal. "I believe your senior partner claimed your corporate culture was built on inclusive, forward-thinking values. I'll be sure to inform him tomorrow that we are going with a different firm. Enjoy the flight, Charles. I have work to do." Mason slipped his noise-canceling headphones over his ears, effectively erasing the banker from his existence. Kensington slumped back into his seat, his face ashen, realizing the brutal reality of karma. It rarely limits its collateral damage. For the remainder of the 6-hour flight, Mason observed. He watched Sarah step into a leadership role that was miles above her pay grade, handling the cabin with a quiet, efficient grace that Camilla had never possessed. Midway over the Atlantic, while the rest of the cabin slept, Mason walked back to the galley to stretch his legs. He found Sarah quietly logging inventory on the company tablet. "You're doing an exceptional job, Sarah," Mason noted, leaning against the metal counter. "Thank you, sir." It's been a night," she admitted, letting out an exhausted breath. "I have a question for you, strictly off the record," Mason said, crossing his arms. "Was tonight an isolated incident with Camilla? Or is this a pattern?" Sarah hesitated. Corporate loyalty battled with her own moral compass. But looking at the man who had just dismantled a bully without raising his voice, she decided on the truth. "It's a pattern, Mr. Sterling," Sarah whispered, looking over her shoulder to ensure they were alone. "She treats anyone who doesn't fit her profile terribly, and she's incredibly hard on the junior crew, especially crew members of color. 3 different flight attendants have filed formal HR grievances against her for discriminatory remarks in the galley." Mason's jaw tightened. "And what happened to those grievances?" "Nothing," Sarah replied, a bitter edge to her voice. "She gets consistently high ratings from the VIP frequent flyers. She knows all the executives. Whenever a complaint goes to the in-flight services department in London, it quietly disappears. She's protected." Mason nodded slowly, processing the information. The problem wasn't just a rogue, racist flight attendant. The problem was an institutional rot that protected her. He pulled out a sleek, black notebook and jotted down a few lines. "Not anymore," Mason promised quietly. When Flight PA 711 touched down on the damp tarmac of London Heathrow at 6:45 a.m., the ripple effects of the JFK incident had already crossed the ocean. As the aircraft taxied to the VIP gate, Mason looked out the window to see a sleek, black Jaguar XJ idling on the tarmac, flanked by two anxious-looking men in sharp suits. The moment the aircraft doors opened, a pan-global ground concierge practically sprinted onto the plane, bypassing everyone to stand by seat 2A. "Mr. Sterling," the concierge breathed, bowing slightly. "The CEO's private car is waiting for you downstairs. We have expedited your customs clearance. May I take your bag?" Mason grabbed his worn duffel. "I can carry my own bag, but thank you." He paused at the aircraft door, turning to look back at Captain Mitchell, who had stepped out of the cockpit. "And Sarah." "Captain." "Sarah. Thank you for a safe, illuminating flight," Mason said. "Our pleasure, sir," Captain Mitchell replied, offering a crisp salute. Mason descended the stairs to the tarmac, climbed into the waiting Jaguar, and headed straight for the heart of the beast. The global headquarters of Pan Global Airways occupied a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of London's Canary Wharf. The boardroom on the 42nd floor offered sweeping, panoramic views of the River Thames, a fitting vantage point for the executives who believed they controlled the world from above. At 10 a.m., the massive mahogany table was surrounded by the airline's most powerful figures. Jonathan Hayes, the silver-haired CEO with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, sat at the head. The atmosphere in the room was exceptionally tense. News of the incident on Flight 711 had spread through the executive floors like a wildfire. Mason Sterling entered the boardroom exactly on time. Gone was the unassuming gray hoodie. He wore a bespoke, razor-sharp charcoal suit from Savile Row, an immaculate white shirt, and no tie. He looked every inch the billionaire architect he was commanding, modern, and entirely unflappable. Jonathan Hayes immediately stood up, his face tight with forced composure. "Mason, welcome to London. Before we begin the formal agenda, I want to reiterate my deepest apologies for the horrific—" "Save the apologies, Jonathan," Mason interrupted, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. He didn't take a seat. He walked to the opposite end of the table and stood, resting his hands on the polished wood. "Apologies are for accidents. What happened to me last night wasn't an accident. It was a perfectly executed maneuver by an employee who felt completely empowered by your corporate culture to humiliate a black passenger." The room fell dead silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. "Where is Richard Blackwood?" Mason demanded, his eyes scanning the nameplates. A heavy-set man in his early 60s, wearing a pinstripe suit, cleared his throat from the middle of the table. He was the senior vice president of in-flight services, the man directly responsible for cabin crew management. "I am right here, Mr. Sterling. And I assure you, Camilla Langdon's termination paperwork was processed at 5 a.m. London time. She is gone. It was a tragic, isolated incident." "Isolated?" Mason barked a harsh, humorless laugh. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound dossier. He tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a loud, heavy smack. "This is a compilation of data my team pulled from your own internal HR servers over the last 3 hours," Mason stated, his eyes locked on Blackwood. 14 formal grievances filed by junior staff against Camilla Langdon over the last 5 years. Allegations of racial profiling, verbal abuse, and discriminatory service practices. 3 passenger complaints from economy flyers who were treated poorly when they accidentally used the premium lavatory. Richard Blackwood visibly paled, loosening his silk tie. "Sir, those complaints were investigated. We found them lacking sufficient evidence." "You didn't investigate a damn thing, Richard," Mason fired back, his voice vibrating with controlled fury. "You buried them. You buried them because she served warm nuts to your country club friends and stroked the egos of the VIPs. You created a protective bubble around a systemic liability because it was convenient for you." Jonathan Hayes, the CEO, looked from Mason to the dossier and then shot a lethal glare at Blackwood. "Richard, is this true?" "Jonathan, you know how these legacy pursers are." Blackwood stammered, frantically trying to defend himself. "They have union protection. They have seniority. We can't just fire them over hearsay from junior flight attendants who can't handle the pressure. Do not insult my intelligence, Mason cut in smoothly. He stood up straight, buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture of absolute finality. Let me make something exceptionally clear to this board. I did not inject $500 million into this airline to subsidize a flying country club that discriminates against its own customers and abuses its junior staff. Mason walked slowly around the table, stopping directly behind Richard Blackwood's chair. Karma is a fascinating concept, Richard, Mason murmured, his voice low enough that Blackwood physically flinched. Camilla Langdon thought she was untouchable because she thought I was a nobody. She lost her career because she misjudged reality. You thought you were untouchable because you hid behind middle management bureaucracy. Mason looked at the CEO. Jonathan, my holding company holds 14% of the voting shares. My conditions for keeping our capital in Pan Global are as follows. First, Richard Blackwood tenders his resignation, effective immediately. If he refuses, I will call a shareholder vote to have him publicly terminated for gross negligence. Blackwood gasped, his face turning a mottled red. You can't do this. I have a contract. I have a battalion of corporate lawyers who will tie your severance package up in litigation until your grandchildren are in college. Mason shot back, without missing a beat. You are done, Richard. Pack your desk. The room was deathly quiet. Jonathan Hayes didn't hesitate. He looked at Blackwood and gave a single, curt nod. Security will escort you to your office, Richard. We accept your resignation. Blackwood sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, before he shakily pushed his chair back and stumbled out of the boardroom, a shattered man. Mason returned to his spot at the end of the table. Second condition, he continued, as if the brutal firing had merely been a footnote. We are gutting the HR reporting structure. Any discrimination complaint filed by a crew member or passenger goes directly to an independent, third-party auditor. The days of burying racism under the rug for the sake of VIP satisfaction end today. Agreed, Hayes said quickly, eager to placate the airline's new kingmaker. Consider it done, Mason. And finally, Mason said, the hard edge of his voice softening just a fraction. Flight attendant Sarah, employee ID 88492. She handled a highly volatile, completely unacceptable situation with professionalism, grace, and integrity. I want her bumped from junior rotation immediately. Promote her to standard purser and put her in the fast-track management program. I'll have the paperwork drawn up by noon, Hayes promised. Mason finally took his seat at the table. The purge was complete. The rot had been excised from the top down. Excellent, Mason said quietly, opening a sleek silver pen. Now, let's talk about our quarterly margins. While Mason Sterling was reshaping the corporate hierarchy in a sunlit London boardroom, Camilla Langdon was experiencing a very different reality back in New York. It was 1 a.m. at JFK International Airport. The bustling, glamorous terminal had emptied out, leaving only the hum of floor buffers and the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Camilla sat on a hard, plastic chair near the baggage claim, her tailored uniform feeling less like a badge of honor and more like a straitjacket. Her designer roller bag sat heavily beside her. For the first time in 26 years, she had no flight assignment, no crew hotel key, and no authority. She pulled out her phone, her hands still shaking slightly, and dialed the emergency number for her union representative, a notoriously aggressive negotiator named Thomas Harding. She had relied on Thomas for years to sweep her minor infractions under the rug. Thomas, it's Camilla, she practically gasped into the receiver when he finally answered. You need to file a grievance immediately. Captain Mitchell just unlawfully removed me from PA 711. He cited a passenger disturbance, but the passenger was clearly a fraud. Stop right there, B, Thomas interrupted. His voice wasn't filled with its usual righteous indignation. It sounded tired and incredibly cold. I already got the call from in-flight services, and I got the preliminary report directly from the CEO's office. Do you have any idea who you tried to have arrested tonight? A system glitch, Camilla insisted, her voice shrill with denial. A man in a hoodie who didn't belong in Diamond. First, that man, Thomas said slowly, emphasizing every syllable, is Mason Sterling. His holding company literally owns the airline's majority voting shares. He is your boss's boss's boss. And you called the Port Authority police on him because you didn't like his outfit. Camilla opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The sterile air of the terminal suddenly felt suffocating. The union is dropping your representation, Camilla, Thomas continued ruthlessly. There is no defense for what you did. You violated the core anti-discrimination clause in Section 4 of our charter. The company has witness statements from the first officer, the gate supervisor, and a junior flight attendant. It's an airtight termination for cause. You're entirely on your own. The line went dead. Camilla lowered the phone, the brutal reality of her situation finally crashing down upon her. She was officially unemployed. Because she was terminated for a severe conduct violation, her travel privileges were immediately revoked. She couldn't even use a staff pass to fly home. She had to walk to the standard ticketing counter, pull out her personal credit card, and pay $700 for a middle seat in the back row of a budget airline, leaving at 6 a.m. Karma had stripped her of the very exclusivity she had weaponized against others. But Camilla wasn't the only one caught in the unforgiving crosshairs of Mason's corporate reckoning. 3 days later, on a rainy Friday morning in Manhattan, Charles Kensington strutted into the polished glass offices of Kensington & Weil. He had pushed the uncomfortable memory of Flight PA 711 out of his mind, convinced that a man of his wealth and standing was immune to the consequences of a casual insult. He grabbed a double espresso from his assistant and walked into his corner office, ready to finalize the lucrative merger deal with Mason Sterling's holding company, a deal that would guarantee his end-of-year bonus. Instead of his usual morning briefing, he found the firm's senior managing partner, David Weil, sitting behind Charles's desk. David did not look happy. "David," Charles chuckled nervously, pausing in the doorway. "What brings you down to my floor?" David stood up, holding a single, crisp sheet of paper. "I just got off the phone with Mason Sterling's chief operating officer," David said, his voice deadly quiet. "They are pulling their portfolio. All of it. The merger, the asset management, everything. $1 billion account gone in a 10-minute phone call." Charles felt the blood drain from his face. "What? Why?" "The financials were solid. We had a verbal agreement." "They were solid," David corrected, taking a step toward Charles. "Until you decided to publicly mock the owner of the holding company on a transatlantic flight. Mr. Sterling specifically cited your lack of inclusive corporate values as the reason for the withdrawal. He even quoted you, Charles. Something about moving back where you belong?" Charles opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a defense, a lie, an excuse, anything. "David, it was a misunderstanding. The flight attendant told me." "I don't care what the flight attendant told you," David snarled, tossing the piece of paper onto the desk. "You cost this firm our biggest client of the decade because of your arrogant, outdated prejudices. That is your severance agreement. Sign it, leave your key card, and get out of my building before lunch." Charles Kensington, a man who had spent his life looking down on others, was escorted out of his own firm by building security, carrying a cardboard box of his belongings, while his junior analysts watched in stunned silence. The fallout was swift, silent, and absolute. Mason Sterling didn't need to post a viral video. He didn't need to shout on social media. He simply used the power of consequence to clean house. 6 months later, the culture at Pan Global Airways had noticeably shifted. The independent HR auditing system Mason implemented had cleared out the toxic elements of middle management. And at the forefront of this new era was Sarah. Now wearing the gold stripes of a senior purser, she managed her cabins with genuine warmth, unwavering fairness, and an eagle eye for detail. When Mason Sterling flew to London for the third quarter board meeting, he once again wore a simple, unbranded hoodie and sneakers. He walked onto the flagship aircraft, handed his digital pass to the greeting flight attendant, and turned left toward seat 2A. There were no whispers. There were no demands for paper tickets. There was only Sarah, standing by his suite with a warm, authentic smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, handing him a glass of water before he even had to ask. "It's a pleasure to have you flying with us today." Mason smiled, settling into his seat as the cabin doors closed. The skies were finally clear. Prejudice often hides behind the guise of protocol or tradition, but as this story proves, true character is revealed when people think no one powerful is watching. Camilla Langdon and Charles Kensington assumed they held all the cards, entirely unaware that the man they were tearing down was the very architect of their downfall. It's a powerful reminder that respect shouldn't be reserved for the wealthy or the well-dressed. It is a basic human right owed to everyone you meet. You never truly know who you are speaking to, and the universe has a highly efficient, incredibly precise way of delivering karma when it's deserved.